What's up guys, Metal571 here, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the Sennheiser HD660S. I know a lot of you have been waiting for this review, so here it is. So what is this headphone, as we usually start out with? It's a 150 ohm dynamic driver open back audiophile headphone. And of note is the impedance, because this driver is rumored to be an HD700 based driver. I have no direct confirmation from Sennheiser on that, but that is apparently what it is using. And the build quality. So I think the build quality here is about the same as the 600 and the 650. You'll notice that the color scheme is a little different. We've got matte black basically everywhere this time, as opposed to some dark blue in the 6XX mass drop, and the glossy black in, I think, if I remember right, in here on the 650 and the 600. Well, you know how this thing is. It's the kitchen countertop edition. So I still have my 600 over here, naturally, and have a mod mic adapter on it there, if anyone's wondering what that is. And so really the build quality feels about the same, but the pads are interesting. Supposedly, according to some people on the internet, the pads are different and they have a tougher foam, and it feels like they have a firmer foam. But Sennheiser says they are the same pads as 600 and 650. Maybe they mean they're only going to sell this type of foam in your pads from here on out. There is no such thing as a special 660S pad if you were to replace them. That's my guess. The HD650 style cable is the default cable it comes with. If I can actually get it, here it is. So HD650 cable basically, which is quite, I think, an upgrade over the original HD600/580 cable. So that comes in the box. You get that cable, and you also get the new Pentacon Sony balanced cable, which is really cool. So you can use this as a modern balanced amp with that jack. And of course, the other side is the same connectors. It goes into the headphones, and then you also get a 1/4 inch, 3.5 millimeter adapter. Now, as far as comfort goes, now the comfort on these, these are brand new. And as some of you know, if you've watched my other videos on, I've covered the 600 before, I've covered the 580, 600, 650, I've compared the 600 to the 558, the 598 CS, which is the same thing as a 569. So I've covered this series quite a bit. And if I haven't already said before, the clamping force out of the box is quite high. And a lot of you people will probably be like, what is this thing clamping on my head? And yeah, that's not unexpected, actually. If you want to alleviate it, you can bend the headband a little bit, but you gotta be really careful, because if you bend the headband on this too much, these headbands are known to snap. So the way I dealt with it was just wear it, get used to it, and eventually it becomes a lot looser. And no, that was not me cracking something. So they eventually get easier to wear and not as big of a deal, but they are quite firm out of the box in terms of the clamping force. But that will break in as the pads break in as well. More about that later on. Yeah, and the other thing about the pads is that if they tend to go flat quickly. I'm hoping that if this is a new material they're using, which I don't know for sure, it won't go flat as quickly as the old material does, because in general, people who have owned headphones for a long time, these things, after about a year, the pads are so flat and the sound is very different, hint hint, that you probably have to buy new pads. And new pads are not cheap for these. They're like $40 or $50 for a set of OEM pads. And now is a good part for me to put in here: do not ever use another pad other than the Sennheiser OEM pads on this headphone. Don't do it. You're going to change the sound enormously. This is a fairly well-known fact. So that's how that works. Now let's talk about the sound, which is what everyone wants to know, of course. Now the bass here, I actually found it very similar to the 600, maybe a little bit more like the 580, in that there isn't as much of a mid-bass hump here as you see in a lot of the graphs if you compare them. But in my experience, if I hadn't looked at the graph, I probably would say they sound a lot like the 600's bass. And so as a result of that, that's how the bass sounds. Now, a lot of this review is going to be compared to the 600, by the way, because these are quite similar sounding to the 600, but they are different in some notable ways as well. But they're closer to the 600, I think, than the 650 in sound, so that's going to be where a lot of the comparison goes. And in terms of being similar, what does that mean? That means that there's a usual roll-off starting around 100 hertz and going down quite quickly. These are known to have that roll-off. They haven't really fixed it in any significant degree in this headphone, so what you get here is the classic HD 580/600 style bass. And that is the way it is. You can sort of bump up the sub bass, which I've done in the past with EQ, but if you go too far, it's easy to get these into harmonic distortion land, as I like to call it. And then you're going to end up bloating the higher bass frequencies when you don't mean to, because that's what harmonic distortion does. So don't push them too far, but they can handle a little bit more bass, which is not bad. But that's a known limitation. They haven't really addressed that too much, unfortunately, here. In terms of the mid-range, now here is where probably the most obvious difference is for me in these, is that the mid-range, upper mids, were always a bit shouty with new pads. Again, more on that in later on in the review. I'm going to talk about that more extensively in the conclusion. But with new pads, of course, the upper mid-range here is quite a bit more recessed than the 600, which is nice, because I always thought that the 600 and the 650, more so the 600, had a bit shouty mid-range, but the timbre was always just absolutely spot on, in my opinion. And that's why I always use the 600, as I say to many people, as my absolute reference for mid-range and treble, except the mids are a little forward, but the timbre is just right, at least in my ears. It sounds a lot like a speaker. But these have fixed the shoutier mid-range while maintaining the timbre, and it is fantastic. Super wonderful mids on these. Don't really get so forward as to be a problem, so I don't even need EQ in that region anymore, which is awesome. They're also slightly faster, and I feel like this conveys is the right word, more micro detail than the 600 and 650. The drivers seem to react quicker. They seem to be a little bit more resolving in my experience. Now, treble. This is actually the brightest headphone Sennheiser has made in this line. Slightly brighter than the 600 and 580. Don't get confused and think this is a DT880, but don't be surprised if you're coming from the 600, especially if the pads are worn out, and you go to this and you're like, whoa, there's some treble here. And yeah, there is. So this one is definitely the least likely to be called Veiled award this year for a Sennheiser headphone. I don't find that it gets really strident. You have to be cranking this thing up and listening to poorly mastered electronic music, and then the treble could be a bit forward. But other than that, it's wonderfully micro-detailed, but it can be just slightly peaky in the 10K plus region. So if you're looking for something that's less veiled than the 600 even, but you don't want the shouty mids either, this is what you're looking for, is really the takeaway here on the frequency response. Soundstage I've found to be, again, very, very similar to the 600. It's not a large stage, but it has a sort of hints of that old 3-blob kind of imaging. You know, you get a lot in the center and a lot toward the edges, but it's not really wide, and it doesn't really fill in this in-between between the center and the edges too well. So that's kind of the classic soundstage this series has always had, and it's back again. I wish they had improved that a bit more along with the bass extension, but that is what you're buying here. Isolation, yeah, there's no isolation. You don't use this at work. You don't use this on a plane. You don't use this on the bus or a train. You don't do it. It's for home use in a quiet room, and that's where you use this thing. Otherwise, it's going to leak like crazy. People are going to get annoyed, and you're going to have to crank it up because you can't hear anything, because all the sound from around you is getting in, and you're generating lots of sound to the outside. So it's an open back headphone. I always like to say that, though, as people who have never owned an open back headphone, it really is that open. So don't do those things. Genre pairing, I think this kind of still qualifies as the headphone that does everything decently well, but nothing in particular is amazing on it. So it's not a fun headphone. It's a very neutral headphone, and that's a really really vague term for those of you who have seen my video on neutrality. If you haven't, make sure you check that out. It's very neutral, I think, in the mids. I find the treble just slightly forward, and of course the bass just dies after the mid bass, but that's always been the way these things are. But overall, I think it sounds great for what it is, and it'll work for just about any genre. But like I said, maybe just the slightest bit bright. For electronic music heads, which probably wouldn't enjoy these headphones anyway because they have like no sub bass below a certain point. I still find them enjoyable, but you can do better if sub bass is your focus, is really what I want to say there. As far as amplifier needs in terms of volume is concerned, I'll leave it to other reviewers to talk about how this changes with different amps. That's not my specialty, guys. The amp needs are less than the 600, but even though Sennheiser is kind of advertising this as you can run it on anything, it's not. That is not it. At the most, it probably sounds about 2 dB, maybe 3 dB, absolute max, louder than my 600 at the same volume setting on the same amp. Huh? Exactly. So why would you ever say that this is fantastic for mobile use? No. You can't really run it off a phone. At least you could, but it won't be that loud at all, and you'll have no headroom and all that good stuff. So don't do that. It's still hard to drive. You still need a dedicated, proper headphone amp. So don't try running it out of a phone. All right. So what's the takeaway from all this? I think the first takeaway is I'm actually going to be selling my HD600. That's how much I like this thing, and that's how much of a reference it is now. They fixed the shouty mid-range. The treble is just slightly brighter than my preference, but I think once the pads break in a bit, that will be diminished. And this is also an overall upgrade to the HD600, not the 650. The 650 is kind of this gooey, warm, thick headphone. It's still slightly shoutier, however, than the 660S, and slightly less shouty than the 600, but the treble is quite veiled compared to any of these, even the 600, and even more so than the 660S. So this is a little bit more towards the 600 sound. So if what you're looking for is something slightly brighter and more resolving than the 600 while maintaining most of the other qualities of it, 660S is what you should be buying here. Price is another factor, which I'll get to in a second, though. But that is something of note. Now, I need to make this very clear because a major site seems to potentially have messed this up on their review of this headphone recently. Hopefully they'll revisit it, and I'd like to see that because it will be pretty interesting to see just how much of a difference the pads affect the sound. But this is important. In order to correctly compare headphones from this line accurately, you have to have absolutely brand new pads. And if you don't, the sound difference is so significant that it can make you think one headphone is better than another in certain ways. So with my 600, these pads are a little older and they're a little more worn in. They're not super worn. And it's amazing the difference in sound between taking the pads off these and swapping them between the two headphones is incredibly different. Mainly with the newer pads, you get more bass, you get more treble, and you get more. Okay, I think it's more mids and treble primarily when I swap these two around, and that's the takeaway. The main thing with the brand new pads is that it hugely changes the amount of mids and highs here. We're talking like 4 or 5 dB probably. So any reviewer who is comparing this to the old headphones and they haven't swapped and taken into account the pad condition of each of those headphones is flat out incorrect and not an accurate review. Now, I have taken this into account. I believe I talked about this in the 580, 600, 650 review as well, because it's unusual for pads to affect the sound quite to that degree, and these pads also decay quickly, and so it's easy to get used to the sound of the headphone over time, but it actually is changing consistently as the pads wear in more. So I wanted to make that clear, and hopefully the site that I am not going to mention is just made a minor mistake thinking that was okay to compare all of these headphones with completely different pad condition, and we'll just revisit that, and then they'll have a more interesting take on them. But you have to take that into account. This is kind of a call to all reviewers. The pads make so much of a difference in this headphone. You cannot review it without them being brand new. All right. Another thing I should note, and I don't have a personal opinion on this because I don't have a whole bunch of amps to test with. Of course, all you guys already who are following me know that that's a limitation of this channel. But people have said that the amp scaling in the 660S is worse than the 600 and the 650. Which doesn't really surprise me too much since it's a different driver, so maybe its capabilities are not as good. The interesting thing about the 600, if I hadn't mentioned this before, I think I talked about this a little bit in the Icon Atticus review, but the 600's bass was noticeably different and deeper and went much lower than I've heard it do before, clearly and cleanly, on a high-power tube amp that I was trying with the Icon and Atticus. And so some people are saying that the 660S is not as capable there. Look to other reviewers reviewing this, to trustworthy ones, to judge that. But it's something I want to note here in the conclusions. And overall, from what I'm using here, although I still feel the 660S is the best overall in terms of detail retrieval and if you like the brighter voicing of the 600 versus the 650, I think $499 is too expensive, and I wouldn't buy this headphone unless it's under $399. That is the target that you should be looking into when you're looking for price. Now, this thing hasn't hit Amazon as of this review, at least not that I saw, but when it does, don't buy this thing for $499. I don't think that makes much sense. And that's the MSRP, so hopefully the street prices will actually be lower when they come out. So, thanks for watching, guys. I hope this was helpful. And go out there and tell me which is your favorite Sennheiser in this new trio of headphones below. Do you have the 660S? Are you going to buy it? Does it sound like something you want? This definitely sounds like something I want, because I'll be selling my HG600. And I'll see you guys in the next review.